Please rise as you are able for the reading of the gospel. The gospel is Matthew 5:21 through 37. So if you need to sit down at some point, that's okay too. It's a little bit of a doozy. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment." But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, "You fool," then you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him. Or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for on the grounds of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, "You shall not swear falsely, but shall carry out the vows made to the Lord." But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. And at this time, we'd invite the children up for the children's message. All right. Hi. No rush. Hello. So, how many of you have rules at your house? Okay, you should all be probably raising your hands. That's okay. There's some polling error happening here. So, how many of you, all right, parents of these children, close your eyes. How many of you have rules that you think are dumb at your house? Okay. When I was a kid, there was a rule that I had at my house that I thought was dumb, and that was no running inside the house. Do any of you have a rule like no running inside of the house? No? Is that just generally do any of you have a rule where you're not supposed to run inside your house? Just maybe for your own safety? There was a rule that there was no running inside the house, and I thought this rule was dumb, so I broke it. And I would break it all the time. And I remember one time, this was back, I was living in Wisconsin at the time, forgive me. This was 1996, so the Packers were on their path to win the Super Bowl. I think it was 95 that they won the Super Bowl. I think in 96 they lost. Anywho, the Packers were playing. I was really excited. I was running around the house, and I fell and hit my head against the fireplace. And I actually have a scar. I don't know if you can see it. It's kind of tiny, but it's right here. Can any of you see that? No, it's small. Don't worry about it. You'd have to get really close to my face to see it, and we don't need to do that. So I fell. My head smacked against the fireplace. I fell down, blacked out. The next thing I remember is my dad carrying me with a washcloth pressed up against my head. Sometimes the rules that we think are dumb are actually good rules. I had to admit that. I was only 6 years old at the time, but my parents were right in that time. And the sermon today is going to be about natural consequences, about some rules that we think maybe are dumb, but actually are probably for the best. So, let's pray. Dear God, Thank you for parents. Thank you for rules, even when we think they're dumb. Help us to be patient. Help us to be kind. And help us to love everyone. Amen. Thank you very much. There's no children's church today, right? Am I getting that right? Okay, good. So just go back to your seats. I promise I'll try and make the sermon interesting. Oh, I must say, the pew is a little bit more empty without Pastor Dave here next to me. I do get to spread out a little more, but I do miss him. So I just wanted to take a moment and give my thanks to Pastor Dave and all of the things that he did for this congregation and all of his mentoring of me. It really did mean a lot to me. So, natural consequences. When I was 16, I got my driver's license, and as 16-year-olds are wont to do, I started driving recklessly around everywhere. I had a 2000, I think it was a 2000, it might have been an earlier year than that, a 2000 Ford Windstar, which, as those of you who know what a Ford Windstar is not like the best car to be driving around recklessly because it moves rather slow and it's rather large. However, I learned during winter that if you go around a curve fast enough and there's snow on the ground, you can kind of like make the tail spin out just a little bit. And so I was doing that and took a separate route home specifically so that I could go and spin around in this car, and eventually started going sideways and then overcorrected and then slammed on the brakes and did a 180 and went into the ditch backwards, at which point I thought, oh no, this is terrible. This is what they warned me about in driver's ed. So I had to walk back to my house. This was before I had a cell phone. I had to walk whatever the mile back to my house, head hanging low, and explain to my mom that I had lost control of the minivan and it was in a ditch. And she was very nice about it and got me out. And the natural consequences of my action were apparent to me pretty quickly. I put the minivan in the ditch and was very embarrassed as a result of that. And after that, I was a little more careful in my driving. Sometimes natural consequences happen right after the thing that you do. You drive your parents' minivan, you put it in the ditch, you realize probably shouldn't drive that way. That's not a good idea. Sometimes the natural consequences are much further along the road. And when I became a caretaker of sorts for kids in the juvenile justice system, I really saw this. I was working with a group of kids, and they had gone on a field trip, and unbeknownst to me, during this field trip, they had grabbed a few cigarette butts off of the ground. And so later on, I'd like to point out, not during my shift, but during someone else's shift, they stole a toaster and snuck it up to their room and used the toaster to light the cigarettes so that they could smoke a little bit. And while that's ingenious, I couldn't fault them for that. We actually decreased their punishment because we thought it was so smart. While that's incredibly clever, it's also not great. Smoking is bad, and especially for 15 and 16-year-olds. We don't want to get them into the habit of smoking because they can't see the natural consequences of that action, the natural consequences of lung cancer and of all of those things, and the expense of cigarettes are much farther away. So sometimes the natural consequences are close. Sometimes natural consequences are farther away. And this brings me, I moved it over here, to the Deuteronomy reading that we read from today. And I just wanted to read 30, so this is chapter 30, verses 15 and 16 again. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. I think a lot of the times when we hear about rules in the Bible, when we hear about the 613 different Levitical laws or the commandments that Jesus gave us, we often think that they're for someone else. Like when Jesus says, love your neighbor, we think that commandment is for the good of our neighbor, but not really for the good of ourselves. And I would challenge that. I think the laws that Jesus gave us and the laws that God gave us are actually for our own benefit, to protect us from natural consequences happening. And there's a few instances where I want to highlight that. This is from the gospel text that we read. This is the Sermon on the Mount. This is 5. Let's do 21 to 22, just to reiterate it. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. I read that verse as a kid, and I thought, oh gosh, that's a really high standard. I've definitely called people fools in my life. I don't know if any of you have. And it took me a while to kind of understand why that's actually good for me, to not be angry at other people. You see, when I was living in the Twin Cities, I was often biking around. And when you bike as much as I do, you encounter motorists in maybe an unpleasant way. Let's say somebody cuts you off, or somebody does something that's dangerous and you have to make a maneuver, or somebody hits you, which has happened to me. And it got to be frustrating to me, and I carried around all of this anger, and I thought, maybe what I'll do, I had a backpack that I was wearing, maybe what I'll do is I'll rig up a harness, and then I'll put an egg in each of the pockets. And then that way, when anyone cuts me off, I can take out my egg as I'm biking and chuck it at them. And I was thinking, that way I'm not causing permanent damage to their car, but they know that they did something wrong. And I was thinking about that. I was prototyping it and trying to figure out, and then I realized, like, this is silly. Like, how often would I be using this egg? Maybe like one time a month? And the other 29 days, I'm just carrying around 2 eggs that are more likely going to break on myself and, like, put egg on my face rather than egg on their face. Mark Twain said something along the lines of, anger is a vial of acid that you carry around, hoping to throw at somebody, but you carry it inside you. And it spills, and it erodes you from the inside out. And so when Jesus says, don't be angry at your brothers and sisters, or if you are angry, try and reconcile with them, what he's saying is not just for their benefit, but also for our benefit. It's really hard when you carry around anger. That spills into all of the other elements of your life. This second bit, this is the bit concerning adultery. So this is Matthew 5, 27 through, let's just do 27 through 28. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Let's talk a little bit about this term, objectification. How many of you have heard that term, objectification, before? A few? Okay. Objectification. This pillar is so nice and round. I am objectifying the pillar. And it makes sense. The pillar is an object. It is nice and round. I like it. Now, obviously, I'm not going to point at anybody for this, but there's nobody over here, so I'll point over here. Now, if I was to say, this woman is nice and round, that feels a little bit different, doesn't it? Because that's a human being that I'm talking about. It's different when I'm talking about a pillar, which is an object, which is not a child of God, than when I'm talking about a human being and say that woman is nice and round. I'm objectifying her. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. That adultery, that isn't just something that is an action, it's also a way of thinking, which is an incredibly hard standard to meet. I think the point of these texts is that all of these standards are kind of ridiculous. They're incredibly hard to meet. And you can see how that standard of not objectifying people is good for the woman in this case, not being catcalled, not having things said about her. But it's also good for the person who is doing the objectifying to not do that anymore. It is both good for the victim of that, and it's also good for the perpetrator. Because when we objectify things, we cannot have a relationship with them. I can't have a relationship with this pillar, because it's an object. However, I could have a relationship with that person, but when I objectify them, when I view them just as their body, I can no longer have a relationship with them. So it's better actually for me as a man to not go around objectifying women, because that allows me to actually view them as a whole person. Yes, they have bodies, but that is not the only thing. That is not the most important thing about them. Finally, I promise I won't do it for the whole text because it's quite a long gospel reading. But finally, this bit about divorce. This is Matthew 5:31 through 32. But it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for on the grounds of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. A quick note on this. I think a lot of preachers in the past have taken that passage literally and tend not to take the previous passages literally. You see a lot of preachers talking about the sanctity of marriage, but you don't see a lot of preachers gouging out people's eyes. And yet, I think if all of the men in this room are to be honest with themselves, there are times where I would guess most of us have looked with lust, however you want to define that, at a woman, but I don't see anybody in here with one eye, myself included. That's just the pretense that these standards are incredibly hard for us, but they are also good for us. And I need to explain a little bit about the difference between marriage now and marriage when Jesus was alive. Marriage now is between two equal people coming into a relationship, usually out of love, and there's definitely economic parts to it, but it's primarily about the two people's loving relationship. Marriage in the first century, and for much of human history, was a transfer of property. And it feels gross to say this, but I do feel like it needs to be accurately characterized. It was a transfer of property from the father, who owned the daughter, to the husband, who would then own his wife. That was the way that marriage was looked at. And now we can say that is sinful, and we can say that women are children of God and deserve to be uplifted, but that's just the way that it was back then. And so when Jesus is saying you should not get divorced at all, he's not really critiquing necessarily divorce in itself, but he's saying that this system, this way of transferring property, of viewing this human being, this child of God, as a piece of property, that is sinful. And once more, what would happen to the poor woman once she got divorced is that she would become economically destitute. That's why in the book of Ruth, Naomi is so broken down when her husband dies and when her children's husbands die as well, or when her two sons die, because she knows that widows have it incredibly hard, that they are stuck. They can't really work for their meals. They're viewed as outcasts in society. They're forced into an underclass. And so when Jesus is saying, don't get divorced, what he's saying is that the system that you have put in place is sinful. You should not objectify people. You should not view people as property. But if you're going to, then you're going to be stuck. You are going to be stuck with this person. You are responsible for this person for the rest of your life, if you are going to view them as property. My hope is not to cover all of the different commandments that God gives us. There's a lot of them throughout the Bible, things that we hear day to day, things that come to us, but rather just to help turn our mind so that we don't view these commandments as law to us, that we don't view these commandments as things to burden us or to curse us or to push us down, but rather we see the love in them. That we see that these commandments are given to us for our own benefit. When God tells us to love our neighbor, yes, that is for our neighbor, but that's also for us, because our lives are better when we live with love. And so my prayer for us today is that we would embrace those times where we run into those commandments, where we run into that desire to objectify a person, or we run into that desire to be angry with a person, or we run into that desire to lord over a person, and we meet that desire with love. Amen.